Hello everyone. On behalf of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage INTACH and the INTACH Conservation Institutes, I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Georgia Southworth. She's joining us from New York, and everyone who has joined us for today's talk in the Conservation Insights 2020 lecture series. I'm Dr. Padma Rohila, Director ICI Delhi. Georgia Southworth, the speaker for today, is a rare book conservator who works both privately and on staff at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an associate conservator for books in the Photograph Conservation Department. She received her book and paper conservation training at Camberwell College of Arts, University of the Arts, London, and has been working with the Met since 2005. Fascinated by the countless structures that allow books to function, her focus in the Photograph Conservation Department is on the preservation, research, and treatment of bound volumes, cased objects, and photograph albums. As a private conservator, she has worked on numerous grants, surveys, and projects with New York based cultural institutions, including the New York Botanical Garden, the New York Academy of Medicine, Columbia University, the Morgan Library and Museum, and the Yale Center for British Art. The title for today's talk is Preservation of Photograph Albums, Maximizing Their Care with Cross-Disciplinary Decisions and Minimal Intervention. Photographs are held throughout museum, library, and archive collections in numerous formats. A great number of photographs across all types of collections are housed in photograph albums, and their needs must often be addressed not just by a photograph conservator, but also by a book conservator. Caring for bound art collections requires a holistic approach that balances research, communication, preservation goals, and sometimes conservation treatment. This talk will review a number of album structures and the common degradation patterns. This talk will also include guidelines for preservation, treatment, and storage that incorporate the further environmental and physical concerns raised by these complicated art objects. Before I invite Georgia to begin her talk, may I please request all of you to mute your microphones? Please type in your name, email ID, and organization name in the chat box, and also your questions. We'll be taking those right at the end of the talk. Thank you, Georgia, for the presentation. Over to you now.
Super. Okay. Good morning. Good morning from New York, and I'm delighted to join the INTACH Conservation Insight series today to share in the discussion about the care of photograph albums. Padma introduced the talk. I want to focus on the cross-disciplinary aspect of the work entailed. And I'd like to, there we go. I'd like to acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking today first. I am not actually at the Met today. I'm in my apartment in Jackson Heights in the New York City borough of Queens, and it sits on the traditional homelands of the Lenape, the Matinecock, the Rockaway, and the Maspeth Indian tribes. I also extend a very warm thank you to Padma and her team for welcoming me here. And for the seeming mountain of work that must have gone into making this series possible, particularly this year. And all of you who are here, thank you. And I will, as Padma said, take your questions after the hour, either directly or through the chat box, whichever is best for you. So a little bit of an introduction into my approach to albums. My introduction to photo albums in sort of a professional focused way happened when I joined the photograph conservation team. I was working with Sherman Fairchild, conservator in charge Nora Kennedy at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2007. I'd been in the museum for a couple of years working in the book conservation department. And I moved into Nora's lab on a very part-time basis. I was hired to assess and document the albums that had come into the collection as part of a very large photograph acquisition. And so this sort of serendipitous grant-funded position introduced me not only to this remarkable set of new colleagues in an adjacent discipline, but also to a completely new set of bookbinding structures to study and to understand. I was trained as a book conservator, and I was drawn further into the discipline based on the fascination of all of the myriad structures that allow these codex functions to work. And so here suddenly with these new photograph albums were countless more structures, ones that I really wasn't familiar with, more than just using in a familial way. So it was at the Met that I fell in love with the photograph album. And the majority of the albums that you see in the presentation today are from the Met's collection, and they're carefully labeled as such. There are a number of slides which contain images from either my own personal album study collection that I purchased on eBay or at yard sales for study, or some that are from other individual independent private practice treatments. So as mentioned, as a little bit from the introduction here, obviously photographs are held across museum and library and archive collections in all different types of format. And the needs, as Padma introduced, of these albums and photographically illustrated books are really high-bidder objects that require both photograph conservator attention and book conservator attention, because their parts are so intertwined, but they're distinct in a lot of ways. So with the goal of minimal treatment intervention, it's super important to employ this cross-disciplinary communication in their treatment. And only sometimes does that lead to actually a physical conservation treatment. And so today we have a long time, we have almost a full hour. So I'd like to divide the talk into sort of 4 general sections. I want to talk about their hybrid nature, the fact that they're complex, that photograph albums combine the preservation concerns of both bound volumes and photos, obviously, but how at times these areas of concern can encroach upon one another and sometimes exacerbate each other. And also, and relatively briefly though, because it could fill an entire symposium, I want to talk about the ethical considerations of what and why we're collecting and choosing, and all of these decisions weigh into our treatment plans as well. Because as we all know, obviously within conservation, there's a very established set of ethics and strict parameters, but there's no concrete rule book as to how to proceed in treatment, particularly with objects of this nature. Excuse me, please. Next, I'll talk a little bit about structure and deterioration. This very dramatic photograph. This is one of my study collection objects, and it's obviously in very poor condition, but it does represent some of the, in this case, more advanced preservation concerns that are experienced by photograph albums. And I'll talk about the importance of understanding the mechanics of these albums, and how the development of album structures followed the changes that occurred across the photographic industry, particularly across the 19th century, from the very first photographs in 1839. I also want to review a number of the common structures and their particular deterioration patterns. There are just a few examples I'll share of albums that have come through a treatment queue, and I'll discuss as well the decisions that were taken in planning their different conservation approaches. And lastly, I want to dedicate the end of the talk to the importance of preservation, and how preventative conservation really plays perhaps the biggest role in succeeding at the broader goals that we all have in the preservation of our shared cultural heritage. And so as well, at the end of the slideshow, I will discuss some exhibition and storage materials that are employed in our lab that are deemed safe, though that comes with a testing caveat and a discussion of collaboration with the Department of Scientific Research, as well as some handling guidelines and some straightforward instructions for a couple of different protective enclosures, which can be easily and affordably made by caretakers in wherever their location, whether it's a well-funded art museum or university with library staffing or a small local historic society. So, and there'll be 3 PDFs that following the talk I will share with Padma, and she can pass on to all of you, just as general information readers about the care and housing of photo albums. So first, let's take a look at the complex nature of these objects. It's true that the preservation challenges that are introduced by photo albums, they are not unfamiliar to book and to paper and to photograph conservators. But it does bear noting that this overlap of book conservators and photograph conservators doesn't always occur in the same lab or even the same institution. And so sometimes this ends up leading the responsible preservation care of these objects either to a single practitioner or a non-conservator caretaker, or even contract conservators who come in, to address these issues. And both disciplines do require distinct training, only some of which overlaps with the other. So even though through the years I've learned a significant amount, about photos, their history, their preservation, their conservation. I'm not trained as a photo conservator, and I definitely work very collaboratively with the colleagues to determine the individual needs of the albums. And this is not a new issue. In 1999, the American Institute for Conservation held a joint conference with the BPG, or the Book and Paper Group, and the PMG, the Photo Materials Group, at their annual conference to address just this, the preservation of albums and scrapbooks. So 1999 was a long time ago by now. And there are postprints that were produced from that conference through the AIC website. It's actually a very useful guide with some really distinct articles about structural understanding and treatment, as well as a review of an extensive and well put together book and album survey in the big collection at the University of Texas. This is a very established survey that was successful in helping determine the understanding of the album collection there as a whole. And so a discussion of books, all books, photo-based or not, are dynamic objects. And understanding the mechanical structure takes a lot of time and study. All the bookbinding structures that are used for photo albums, they do differ significantly from some of the traditionally bound books familiar to book conservators and binders. And they require research in the form of, like I said, surveying collections, which gives a broader overview of what types of albums are in collections, researching the bindings, and often recreating traditional album structures, which is really, really, really fun. So these are some smaller albums trying to get my head around how the linkage between the sections was put together. And all codex format volumes, the book structure we're most familiar with, they rely on numerous areas of movement to allow that object to function, to give access to the contents. And so at the time of manufacture, of course, the binding structure and the materials they're used, they all work well together. They dance. And this volume opens well, and the joints flex, and the leaves drape, and the sewing structure supports the opening. So all of this is in concert. And critical, of course, is the continuation of these characteristics. But over time, the leather and adhesives and threads and paper and various mechanisms, they do deteriorate, often at their own rates. And they suffer from external conditions. And so that dance of the function of this book breaks down. And then photographs, although generally made, particularly early on, from very high quality materials, and they're developed on strong paper supports, they can be chemically very sensitive and have varying degrees of light sensitivity. And they need their surfaces protected from any touch or any human hand. And they must have their dimensional structure maintained. So it's as if the handling needs of these two different art disciplines are in contrast with one another. And the book conservator is tasked with keeping things moving, and the photograph conservator is tasked with keeping things still. Yet the photograph album combines these two problems. So I do want to share a couple of examples of this hybrid nature of albums and how these two components sort of contend with each other. This most remarkable object, this is the Pencil of Nature. It was considered by many to be the very first photographically illustrated book. It was published by William Henry Fox Talbot, the photography pioneer, invented the salted paper and the calotype processes. Following the introduction of photo in 1839, quickly to commercialize the success, and he works with Nicholas Henneman to produce this series, this subscription series, and it leads through 6 fascicles of photos that are issued between 1844 and 1846. Eventually, they abandoned the project due to declining sales. But you've got this fascicle, which is deemed, as far as structure, a perfect binding, which is a great misnomer in bookbinding nomenclature. The single sheets are adhered up and down the spine. They've got a wrapper around the edges, and it relies on the continued flexibility of those adhesives. And in this case, with these incredibly delicate photos that are not consistently fixed throughout this series of volumes, it adds a tremendous sensitivity to these historic volumes, because they are losing leaves and such. So that's one type of this hybrid nature that's sort of in contrast with each other. This is Emma Charlotte Dillwyn Llewellyn's album. It was produced between 1853 and 56, and it holds 128 salted paper prints and albumin silver prints. And the photographs inside are primarily dab mounted at their corners, leaving the bulk of the photographs not adhered to the leaf of the volume. And because this is a traditionally bound volume with sections that are sewn through the folds and the flexible, text block leaves, this increases greatly the risk to these very thin and delicate mounted photographs in the action of the book. So with flexible leaves, in this case, it's super important that in the handling of an album like this, that the planar stability of the leaves is maintained during using the album. This next slide depicts a CDV album, a carte de visite album of views of Central Park, produced in the 1860s. Albumin silver prints in gouache and varnish are present on the actual artworks that are slid into the windows in this carte de visite album. It was produced in the 1860s by Stacy's Photographic Carte de Visite, which is a company in New York City taking advantage of this boom of the industry of photo and the carte de visite format. It has paintings in it by the American artist Ambrose Jackson, as well as photographic images of New York's brand new amazing treasure, Central Park. So it's this iconic part of New York City history in a very, very common structure. There are numerous structural variations to albums like this, but most of them are built around the format of the carte de visite, which is invented in 1854 by Disdeddy. And it usually consists of an albumin print, which is adhered to a small cardboard cart, approximately 2.5 by 4 inches or 64 by 100 millimeters. And the photographs, they're mounted to a stiff card in order to counter the dramatic curl that happens with these thin photos as they dry. And so with this new stiffened card, a new binding structure is devised because the flexible leaf binding no longer works. And interestingly, the timing of these sorts of albums coincides with really the democratization of photography. More and more people are having their images taken. They're able to own their own carte de visites. They're able to keep them in albums, to collate them, to display them. So it's becoming a much more common occurrence to have and own photographs. And in this case, the function of these albums is successful by keeping the spine perfectly still, by keeping it stiff and allowing the leaves to flex on a guarded stub structure where the leaf is attached to a stiff guard and the paper or the cloth and sometimes leather that make up that guard is responsible for the continued action of those albums. Completely different from so many of the early sewn structures that are familiar to book conservators trained in a more traditional way. And here we have a album of spirit photographs. This is a genre of early decades of the 20th century. The idea of a double negative producing an image of a person with whom you're communing who has passed on. This is an album from a medium. And it has silver gelatin prints that are mounted on the leaves, on the rectos and the versos, adjacent to manuscript descriptions on paper. And so this is an age-old structure. It's very simple. They're single sheets, which are adhered with a wrapper and just simply sewn through the side. And it relies on the fiber strength and the fold endurance of those leaves and the binding structure to continue folding at that same location over and over and over. So the photographs in this album, the silver gelatin photos, are quite stable, but they are mounted together with these manuscript ink notations. And because of the structure of the book, those do end up face to face in a closed album. And lastly, I want one more, I think. Yeah, one more. This is a crazy object. It's a Sewn album from the early 20th century, from 1916 and 17. It's hand titled Girls I Have Known, which is not quite as creepy as it sounds. It's a personal memory book. It was made by a teenage boy with various types of inserts describing and complimenting the girls in his school class. But it's a sewn structure, so it moves like a traditional book. It's more of a scrapbook, but the very, very many inclusions, the photographs and inks and various weights and sizes, does present all sorts of different preservation and handling and exhibition concerns. So these are 5 examples of the many, many different album structures that have this sort of hybrid nature of an album structure and the photographic contents, not contending with each other, but creating challenges, preservation challenges for each other. Um, so moving on, second, I'd like to focus a little bit on the structure of some of these albums and the deterioration patterns that are regularly seen based on those structures. There are countless structures used, but these are the ones that are more prevalent than others. I'd like to talk about them here in terms of history and the mechanisms that make them work and their anticipated preservation concerns. And as we just discussed, the deterioration patterns arise from a combination of the quality of the materials and what is being asked of them in the function of the artwork. Obviously, albums and scrapbooks are employed to house images or a combination of images and text. And they serve as protective enclosures. They serve as mechanisms to keep photographs flat, as display devices. And decades on now, we can see that these albums have been both a benefit at times to the photographs mounted on their pages and at times a detriment as well. I often say, half jokingly, that the first 100 years of photographic history, beginning in 1839, coincide with 100 years of relatively poor bookbinding materials, and that you end up with structures that suffer over time sometimes because of this. It's only partially true, of course, but it is true that the album structures across the 19th and 20th centuries, they're designed by innovative bookbinders to accommodate this various and changing process by innovative photographers. And that all of this coincides with the growth of industrialization, I mean, particularly across England and Europe, but that you've got the mechanizations of material production resulting in reduced long-term preservation quality of the materials that are produced, whether it's the threads or the paper stock or the tanning of the leathers. And so often we find that the breakdown of the bookbinding materials that make up a volume in which the high quality photographs are mounted. And of course, that leads to all sorts of ethical considerations and structural decision making on the preservation team's shoulders. I would like to discuss briefly sort of 2 categories, the area of sewn binding structures and the area of these guarded stiff leaf structures. After years and years of experimentation and study, the first photographs are introduced and almost immediately they start being bound in blank books. Bookbinders accommodate these additions of materials in many different ways, as they need to compensate for the amount of material being added as it would be in a scrapbook. And so they begin altering the structures to account for this depth of new contents. Leaves are removed, you can see this in the center, and stubs are added. The swell is reduced at the spine. There's a lot of ways that bookbinders accommodate this new addition of material. And here in this slide, we see books that are bound with flexible leaves, sewn through the folds. Here in the center, you see a book that was sewn with leaves that are removed, which would then accommodate an addition of another piece. That concept of the spine can be created by adding V stubs there at the spine during the sewing of the book, turning your section to create an extra stub through which to sew, adding individual free stubs. There are a lot of ways to accommodate what will be added into an album. And then at the tail, you see a traditional structure again of a sewn structure. On the other hand, the guarded leaf binding structures. This is this accommodation of a thicker card, something of more bulk. And with individually mounted images, the flexible leaf bindings, as I said, no longer work. And stiff board or guarded leaf albums, where a board is guarded to a stub, quickly appear on the market. CDD albums and later, larger format cabinet card albums are found in great numbers across photographic collections. And here are some of the more common ways that they are constructed. I've broken this little group into a primary hinge group and a secondary hinge group. The photo in the middle indicates a primary hinge where the leaves swing one to the next with a guard that is inserted underneath the facing papers of these boards. At the tail, or at the lower photograph, is a secondary hinge where you have a primary hinge that's sewn, like a normal book would be, and then the leaf is swung on a cloth or paper or other hinge. This is often used to accommodate a deeper or a thicker volume, allowing it to open with more display range. So in these cases, the carte de visites are slid into the tails of each leaf, most often through a slit of unadhered facing paper, but sometimes through a pre-prepared slit, either in the front of the facing paper or from the foredge. And this, if two are slid in back to back, they fall into this recess. You can see the slits at in the second photograph where the photographs are inserted, and it leaves the rectos or the images matted for display for the viewer. And they're not difficult to insert, though there is abrasion and the concern of hurting the surface of the photo, but they are very difficult to remove safely. And albums like this, they rely on adhesives and the flexibility and fold endurance of the hinging materials, but they don't rely on threads and spine supports and the ability of the compression of sewing supports to help encourage and hold up an opening. So, and later we see as well, of course, various different ways of holding single sheets together. There are post-bound albums and ring binders and spiral binders and plastic comb binders, many, many different routes that are employed. And though less common, there are some wonderful adaptations of leaf joins. On the left is an accordion structure with brass pins holding this little tiny, tiny locket album together. And this leaves the opening action almost entirely mechanical. The middle is a cabinet hinge album where leaves swing one to the next across these metal hinges. And so in this case, you're purely mechanical and you end up with this really elegant structure. You can see in the picture on the bottom, the spine materials have broken down, but the function of the text block join is in very, very good shape. There's no adhesion there at all, simply swinging over top of this rod. And then on the right is a patented Eclipse album, which I include only because it's amazing. And it's this modified secondary metal hinge, which is really, it's just remarkable. And it's a study collection object. I haven't seen any others like that yet, but it's beautiful. So all of these albums, they do present particular preservation concerns, and understanding these mechanisms give the conservator the tools they need to treat them and to take care of them. One thing that it's essential to look at and talk about, and it absolutely falls into a structural element of these volumes, is how the photographs are mounted in the pages. And it's any number of ways. Very common early on is overall mounting. I mentioned this dab mounting at the corners with just a little bit of adhesive. Many are adhered just around the edges or across the top edge or one edge. As with the CDV albums, things are slid into the pages from different locations. At times you see albums that have slits in the actual support leaves where the corners of the photographs are inserted underneath. There's no adhesive used here, but it does sometimes result in the deformation of the surface of the photograph. Photo corners are common in use. Some albums have photos that are slid these are more modern, just under a facing paper that serves as a mat, but without a recess there to receive a card. Obviously, there's a lot of hinging of photographs, whether it's in a conservation treatment with Japanese paper in a preservation consider, or even just in a studio with hinging tapes. And there are various other ways of photo attachment. And a broader look across albums and the deterioration concerns, many of which overlap either with photograph concerns or with binding concerns, but there are some that are particular to albums, starting at the inside with the photographs, obviously their attachment method, their physical and chemical, and structural integrity, whether or not the photograph itself has suffered any damage, whether they've detached from the pages, whether the text block leaves have imparted any damage into the photographs. Obviously, there's physical wear and tear, sometimes, based on the album movement. And then there are inherent vices, whether there are processes that are unstable or dyes that were used in color photos. And then the text block itself, on which the photos are mounted. You've got text block leaves of varying different qualities. You have the mechanical action of the text block, and like any binding concern, the text block to the binding connections are very different in photograph albums. And then the binding itself, and these are more broader book conservation concerns generally, the condition and the preservation of the covering materials and the action of the spine, as well as any clasps or ties. So as far as deterioration concerns, some visual cues to photograph album deterioration. The top two images, all of these are stiff board bindings, but the top two images show damage that has happened to these study collection objects, very, very likely from inserting and removing either tintypes or CDVs from these. Again, I said the insertion is quite straightforward. The removal of these, which was common, the idea of changing images within these albums as your own display, your own sort of curated album, is quite common. And it's a difficult endeavor to do without damaging the support, particularly as these papers produced during the mechanical industrial age and they become more brittle and they become easier to damage with any sort of mechanical involvement. Down below, you see a very common structural element with the deterioration of leather and the sewing supports that can't support the weight of this big heavy board and the continued flexing action. And then at the bottom right, that curved piece is the cloth join, which is peeling away from a stub, which is resulting in planar instability of this album. And then these, I mentioned this photo here at the top, that the action of the text block is in very good condition, but very common is the breakdown of the spine structure there. And then something common to CDV albums is this desiccation of the adhesives, which hold the facing papers to these cores, these board cores, and that separation, which of course results in instability with the photograph mounting spot. So third is a discussion of a couple of different conservation treatments of albums that have come through the queue and how the decisions were made based on the condition of the album and the intended use of the album. For these, let me see here. This first album is a very straightforward carte de visite album with a primary hinge, that page to page to page. And it's an over-the-counter stationer's album, but it's filled with these really, really important iconic images from the very first days of the American Civil War in 1861. And they're images of the evacuation of Fort Sumter, which means a lot more to the American audience than to some others. But it is this iconic part of American history. And as with many of these albums, there are facing papers and a breakdown of the primary hinges and a dislocation from the case itself. So in book conservation speak, they're not complicated issues, but they are damaging to obviously the structure of this album. And so this was a matter of rebuilding the primary hinges between the facing papers and recasing into a repaired or a conserved case. The image on the lower right indicates the importance of creating housings, study cradles, or even this exhibition cradle that accommodate exactly the opening and the spine. Damage can be avoided in making sure that the albums are well supported during their use, whatever this use is. A second is this tiny little gem tintype album. And this is a very sort of straightforward book conservation treatment, whereas the text block itself was in relatively good condition with needed a little support at the spine, but it did receive a tiny little reback of leather. And I do consider the reback sort of the last treatment. It is an invasive treatment. It can return function to a book, but it is really, I try to accommodate a book's needs in various ways before I introduce a reback. In this case, it's what the book needed, but it's an example of a tiny little structure that was given back its ability to open and flex properly. And this object is a completely different story. This is an album that was produced, an art object that was produced in 1912. It's a combination of text and 30 collotype images that were printed on incredibly thin paper and mounted into this beautiful pre-prepared album. It is a story of the images representing the dancers in the Ballet Russe as they perform the 1912 ballet, the short 12-minute ballet piece of the Afternoon of a Faun. And the lead dancer for the Ballet Russe at the time is Václav Nijinsky, and he is also the choreographer of this and the lead star. So he works together with Serge Diaghilev of the Ballet Russe to produce this beautiful art product with the photographer Adolf de Meyer. And I looked at this album in the Met's collection for about a decade, indecisive and not entirely sure how to approach it. But that was obviously the timeline was reduced when a curator decided to exhibit it. So one of the issues in this album is that there are leaves that have pre-prepared spaces. They're leaves of text. It's sewn through the fold. And the adhesive that held, you can see on the right-hand side, the adhesive that held these very, very thin collotypes into their positions had desiccated, and 6 of the 30 of them had fully detached. My initial plan as a book conservator was to return them to their locations and then permit it to be exhibited. And the curator said, why don't we take advantage of this opportunity to actually show 6 original objects on the wall, which is one of the things we contend with regularly, this idea that though this is this intimate curated story, all of these albums or books for that matter, in exhibition, really you're sharing only one. And there's this desire either through electronic means or other to share more of that story. So this presented us with this opportunity. And working with the departmental preparator, we produced 6 mounts that represented or mocked up the style of the pages of the actual album. And using these, it was a process of, in the middle is an image of me removing carefully this really, really desiccated adhesive from the verso of one of the images. And then I spent a number of weeks back and forth working with the Department of Scientific Research, determining a black paper, of which there are actually very few, a black paper that was deemed safe and acceptable for display adjacent to this art object. So after a round of testing, we determined papers that were usable, and I hinged this 6 completely detached collotypes down to these pre-prepared mats that the preparator for the department, Predrag Dmitrievich, made. And the little hinges, because they're black, they're acrylic on Japanese paper, they were able to basically disappear, almost disappear, rather than dab melting them back into position. And so mounted on the wall in the center image are the 6 original collotypes. One is exampled at the left. The album is in the foreground with one image shown. And then on the right, you see a cradle that's made again to that specific opening, which is super important for the structural maintenance of the album. And then following the exhibition, my treatments continued and I was able to return those 6 back into their original locations in the album. So in this case, there was an opportunity to show these, whereas very often I absolutely discourage taking any images out of an album for display. But very rarely we're presented with an opportunity like this, and we can actually take advantage of it in sort of an ethically understood manner. And it's a beautiful album, and it remains very, very delicate, but at least it's been conserved and the pieces are back where they belong, and it's been very carefully imaged by the digital department, the imaging department at the Met. So it's available online now. And then these 2, they're completely unrelated to each other, are examples where I did nothing. I worked on preservation housings and making sure that they were carefully documented. On the left, this black leaf from an album is actually quite familiar to many. There's a very, very softly sized short fiber black paper, and it absolutely loses its structural integrity. And there's really no way to return that. There's a discussion of reformatting these albums. And in a case like this, this is the recto of one of the leaves, and it's got 12 images on it, but the entire volume, excuse me, please, had over 600 images. And the black paper supports had handwritten white annotations. There are a lot of things to contend with here. And the decision was taken not only just on the intended use of the album, but the integrity of the album, to really carefully image it, document what was there. The individual leaves were sleeved in inert polyester in mylar, and it was housed. It's always a desire to make the book function again as a single integral unit, but in this case, really the best option was imaging and preservation housing. And on the right, this magnificent object is an album and scrapbook of really amazing stained glass designs by a British company. And it's a strange object. Clearly, the compensation issues were not addressed. And this, again, there are a lot of mends and tears and cleaning, and a preservation housing was made for this object rather than try to recreate some sort of new structure into which to put all of them, because it in itself was a travel and study object used by the company. So there are numerous examples, less satisfying in some ways, but numerous examples where the decision is really to not treat at all. Um, and it's a matter of coming to the right conclusion as to what you can and cannot do, to return a book to its previous state. So those are some examples of albums, and then I want to discuss for the end of this talk the importance of preservation and preventative conservation in approaching photo albums, and how the needs of photo-based materials are different than traditional books, based on the material of the objects. So these slides have fewer images of albums, but they are guidelines, and we'll go through them. And at the end, as I mentioned, after the talk, I'll share 3 PDFs with Padma, who will then share them with you. One thing that I really want to talk about first, as part of the broader preservation approach and the broader world of a conservator of whatever discipline, is the importance of research and advocacy and education, really blended into all the other work that we undertake. It's essential to the field and to promoting what we do. So our dedication to any genre of art obviously involves much more than just the treatment of the objects in our care. And the proper stewardship of these collections requires that we do research them, and that we find a way to garner the time and the effort and the resources needed to learn as much as possible about the material structure and history of these objects, as well as their art historical stories, in the sense that that can inform a lot about what we know about the history of the object, and therefore how we want to store and study and treat it. So in collaboration with conservation scientists, we'll study these objects to determine the best practices for conservation and storage. And as well, it's important that we educate. And I mean this sort of in 2 directions. Not only do we want to educate the next generation of conservators, but also we want to educate in the other direction, helping donors and curators and foundations and museum administrators really understand the value of our work and how it falls into the mission of these cultural heritage institutions. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with advocacy and dedicating the time and the resources necessary to really raise awareness across various communities to the work that we do. One thing that I believe is a common thread throughout a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different conservation practices is that the research and the education and the advocacy that are so important to the broader field sometimes get sidelined by busy exhibition schedules, or simply contract conservation treatments, or limited funding and staff. And so this thread of the broader scope of what we're really trying to accomplish is important to continue to push, and very much a preservation approach to the field. And I have a few text slides here that I'll go through, but mostly as a review of how photograph albums are different from other materials, how their hybrid nature makes them vulnerable to different materials and housings. As far as handling, this is not a lesson. It's more of a review. I will generally always approach an album that I don't know with gloves. There's so many different aspects to it, I don't really know what's going on with the pages, how they're adhered, where the photographs are, and I want to be extremely careful that I'm not handling anything where I could risk the photographs housed wherein. Like with all books, obviously, if a album is on a shelf, remove it from its spine and not from the head cap. There are a lot of collections where even photograph albums that are considered art objects are not, they're not yet in preservation housings. Like all books, the covering materials are of particular concern. And once an art object is deemed, valuable enough to be in a collection for whatever reason, the album really needs to be treated like that as a whole and lifted. The album binding becomes more than simply a protective device. Um, Other things that I contend with, having seen the slides of the varying different opening concerns, always using angled cradles or book supports so that you can have two hands free, and angling and using those in modifying the angle of that opening to whatever the specific page spread is, because the structure of the spine is involved. Um, Looking at the flexing of the leaves of an album, ensuring the planar stability as a leaf is turned so that the laminar structure of a photograph isn't challenged. And handling these albums and turning the pages only at the edges and with my gloves, unaware of whether there's a photograph on the next page that I would inadvertently touch. Um, because the adhesives used throughout this era of photos and whatever other structures, they are desiccating and they are aging. It is common for photographs either to detach fully or partially, which sometimes can be even more damaging. Being super aware of these concerns and being sure that no photos or interleaving slip into the gutter when it's closed. Um, and talking about storage and housing recommendations, it's true that most photographs, not all, but most photographs benefit at cooler or colder storage temperatures. And most of the albums are still held at standard museum environment conditions, contending with all of the different materials there. There's a lot more study, an area of research that I would like to pursue much farther. The environmental storage conditions for albums and what is absolutely the best there. Both photographs and many of the bookbinding materials are particularly light sensitive. This is a concern, obviously, for research and housing and storage. Um, Traditional housing materials for rare books, I'm not actually really using cloth covered board drop spine boxes at this point. For all photograph albums, I'm generally encouraging the use of Audi and photo activity test materials that have passed the PAT, heritage board, other tested enclosure materials that may or may not be quite as handsome, but I know that the tested materials will impart no damage into that photograph with its very sensitive chemistry. Um, Microclimating our housings to make sure that any temperature or relative humidity fluctuations are mitigated and slowed. Photograph albums can be comparatively very heavy. They have mat boards, photographs, adhesives, a number of different elements that per size really comparatively weigh down this album, and they can damage themselves. So I often push for storage in folio shelving as opposed to vertical on shelves, though it is an issue with linear feet and collections managers and limited library space. But it's really important that particularly larger albums with a guarded leaf structure are stored flat or stored in folio shelving if possible. I will label the protective enclosures or the housings to offer, instructions to wear gloves, any particular handling instructions. And this offers not only good care and handling, but also a message to the user that the object inside is worth that treatment and that valued care. And if there are more complicated housing designs that accommodate something like the album at the end that wasn't treated, that had a very pronounced foredge, I'll actually offer instructions to those housings and how to work them, so that not only are they removed safely, but when they're returned, they're safely re-enclosed. And then touching again a bit further on housing materials, this here is a photo, an example of these heritage board boxes, which I know are tested materials that have no long-term off-gassing or degradation patterns that could impart damage to the photograph albums held within. They're also lightweight, they're also affordable. One thing that's a wonderful resource here, we get ours through Talus, where Talus is a conservation supply company that will make these boxes based solely on measurements, without us either bringing someone into the museum or sending the objects out of the museum. So a carefully measured object can receive these heritage board bindings. And then making sure that the objects that we display and mount and store are inert and safe. We employ phototext paper as an interleaving paper, various four-flap enclosures. On the right, there are some suppliers here that we generally use, and with luck, there are either equivalents or contacts with companies that produce the materials that are needed and safe for enclosures. And then lastly, just some mounting considerations, and these are obviously broad swath recommendations, and each particular object needs its own specific consultation. But the idea that it's really, there's reviewing these, that it's important to include the consult of both a photograph and book conservator if possible, understanding the needs of both of those materials, and building a cradle that's specific to the page opening. I noted that a couple of different times throughout the talk, but here as well, in this plexi cradle, you can see that it was built very carefully to accommodate a specific opening in that volume. Again, housing materials that have passed required testing. I caveat here with the hope that there's an opportunity to test each batch of new materials, because oftentimes proprietary recipes and proprietary arrangements for the material product are not available to the public. Oftentimes we do use polyethylene strapping. It's softer than Mylar to keep a volume open. And one thing, this next, I wrote that albums may appear robust even when in poor condition. I'd like to expand a little bit upon this. In a situation like at the Met, the photograph albums are held in art collections most commonly. And throughout whatever sort of collection, oftentimes albums are not viewed regularly. And whether they're housed or not, they may appear very robust. Yet an album, because it's this dynamic object, there's a lot of structure and movement that's asked of that album. So for example, for me in an art museum, if a curator selects an album and says, I'd really like to display this, and I'd like it to be part of this 3-venue exhibition rotations. It starts in New York, and then it goes to Paris, and then it goes to Malta, and then it comes back and is back in the vault. Something like this. That album, which looks quite strong and appears to function quite well, hasn't been opened in 60 or 70 years. What is about to be asked of it is quite dramatic. The curator selects an image, and then he or she discusses it with the conservator, and then there's potential treatment, and then it goes to the photo studio and gets imaged. And then it goes to the preparators who measure for a cradle, and then it gets condition checked, and then it goes back into the exhibition. And all of this happens at these 3 locations. And then finally, a year later, when it comes back and it's put back in its original housing and goes back into the vault, that album has been opened and closed 30 times. And it's a particularly aggressive ask of this art object. Whereas the matted photograph, which is exhibited next to it, is handled only by the mat and is kept planar, stable, and still. And it does encounter a lot of handling, and it does encounter environmental damage. But the idea that the album is asked, a tremendous amount is being asked of these albums for things like a rotation of an exhibition. And those are considerations to hold up front when reviewing the needs of an album and whether or not it really should be exhibited or shown. And that's where the last two fall in. Consider exhibiting facsimiles. We do not do this very often. One particular example was with an extremely light sensitive photographic album, and it offered us at least the opportunity to share what was in the album with the viewership. It's it's sort of a last option, but it is nice in an art museum to be able to share the art with the viewers, and just understanding an album's limitations in the sense that they are these delicate hybrid complex materials. And so thank you. I would love to take any questions you have. I've included here contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out. And then this list of documents here at the bottom, which I will share with Padma and she will share with you. I really do appreciate your time this morning, my morning, being here, the welcome to the Conservation Insights series, and a number of people with whom I've worked that have made the study of these albums possible and so delightful for me. So thank you again. And Padma, that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Georgia. Thank you so much. With your permission, I'll start taking up the questions.
Super, yeah.
The first one is, I think, it does say tips, but I think it's a common problem. Modern day photo preservation, photographs printed on photo paper tend to get damaged due to moisture and heat, leading to them sticking together. Photos
Yes.
tends to stick. Plastic films of albums, they also tend to lose the planar dimension and stick to the glass of framing at places, creating issues for mounting. So, any suggestions or how to deal with this problem? Any practical solution to this?
Well, oftentimes the quality of the housing materials is super critical, as I said. For particular photograph issues, like the blocking of photographs, either to a mounting material or to another photograph, or to a glass glazing, these are issues that I always consult with a trained photograph conservator. So this is part of that collaborative discussion. And if those issues are present in objects that I'm responsible for, I work with photograph conservators to determine the best method forward with those, whether there are particular treatments or housings that can help accommodate or contend with those issues. So that's a perfect example of this sort of necessary collaborative communication.
Thank you.
So to be honest, I defer issues like that to the photograph conservators. They're not issues that I would feel confident addressing myself, just because they're really, really very complicated.
Okay. The next question is, the cradles you showed are beautiful. What material was used for their construction? What is their construction like?
Of the storage boxes?
No, the cradles,
Oh, the cradles. Yes. Those cradles there are the ones that were molded to the particular openings and covered in cloth. They're created from tested mat board, adhered together at a particular angle, and covered with cloth that has been sourced by a company called Creation Bauman. And these are materials that are deemed cloth materials that are deemed safe for exhibition and treatment in art objects. That's one of the lists that I provided, but it's a company called Creation Bauman, and so they're covered in that material. But underneath that, it's mat board. And then the one at the end is a molded plexi cradle, which is from pure, just polyester plexi, and it's a way of molding to a specific object, and it's in some ways a more affordable and faster cradling method. But there are numerous ways to cradle, even just for study room. I've always said that, there are all kinds of materials that we can use to make sure that we have a safe physical environment for the brook.
Thank you. There is a question for all the participants. I hope everybody has seen it. It is to suggest if you have seen any photographic album structures in your countries which are quite different than what Georgia showed us. So please do give your references if you have seen. I haven't seen. I think I've only seen the normal photo albums in my life. So if anybody else Has other
Yes, share with me all of the cool photograph structures.
do share? It'll be nice to know. So the next question is, there was a question on suggesting some reference books on photographic conservation. Now, I really don't know whether it's again something that you would be familiar with, but if you know any, maybe that's.
I do have a running reading list of articles that have been written about structures and conservation and preservation issues. I can sort through that and find the most relevant pieces. There's a lot of room for literature still in this field. And so, but there are definitely some resources. I can send those along to you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is from Teresa. Have you ever encountered albums with more rigid photographic materials like slides, glass plate negatives, or lantern slides? If so, how would the binding structure compensate for the weight of these photographic material?
I have worked with various collections of glass plate negatives and others, though not in this, not so much mounted into volumes. But I would assume and suppose that these are housed in similar ways to the carte de visite and other sort of physical structures, but with mounting devices that are strong enough to hold those. I have not worked on albums that have a lot of other types of materials mounted in them. The tin type, but then of course it's a smaller metal structure, but not a lot of big and super heavy glass-based structures.
Thank you. What are the steps to remove photograph from glass surfaces?
Something that is blocked to a glass surface, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah,
This
I
is a
think
very
it's not to.
particular concern, and I would always address that with a photograph conservator. Though I know that that's an area that presents a really distinct and difficult preservation concern, but it's not something that I have experienced removing. Certainly not with book conservation work.
Now, a question.
I do notice, I'm sorry to interrupt you, I do notice that there are a lot of, this is a perfect example. A lot of these questions are really focused on that overlap of
Yes,
book and
exactly.
photograph concerns
Yes.
and how they do exacerbate each other. And oftentimes there's a disconnect in the care team, not intentionally by any stretch, but simply by the structure of the way we set up our practices. And so the collaborative unit there is really essential. And it would be great to be able to expand on that, have resources available on both sides, just in the sense that so very many photographs are held in bound structures,
Yeah.
and therefore presenting these preservation concerns to all sorts of different care teams.
I have a question. If you post with a problem of a scrapbook photo album, the one that you shared, where there are the photographs which are, there, and then there are inscriptions, notes, maybe some personal things on the support itself. But then the support is, it's deteriorated. You want to do something to it. It's easy to remove, or, to remove the photograph from that support and transfer it to a safer new support, but then the inscriptions are there on the same, so that's a tricky situation sometimes. So what would you advise, transferring this over to the new support as well, or?
Well, that is exactly the issue to contend with. And
Hmm.
it's a matter of making the decision as to whether or not to reformat that entire artwork. I often push to make sure that albums are held as their integral units, but as we saw with that black leafed album, that's
Hmm.
really not an option. There's no way to return that safely to a structure without reformatting it. And
Hmm.
whether that means, and it does happen in some rare circumstances, it's very labor and other intensive to make this happen. But the idea that you could transfer the photographs to a new leaf and somehow recreate a visual reproduction of those inscriptions and such. If there is a way to allow viewer access without that removal of the original construction and making of that, those are decisions that take a long time. I do generally, I myself am a conservative conservator. I try very hard to limit my interventive treatments, and I will try to keep an object as a single unit. And even in those leaves, for the history and the study of the creation of that object, that deteriorated paper, at least in very careful digital documentation, really needs to be
Yeah.
maintained. If there is continuing damage happening from this support leaf to the photographs themselves, the reformatting of that and all of the work that entails absolutely should be in discussion, but it doesn't always necessarily weigh out as the best ultimate option. It's a very tricky issue, and oftentimes it's sort of an interesting, that leads me into an interesting discussion that I find myself prevaricating with very discussions about whether or not there is a good option for some of these materials. There are very labor intensive interventive treatments that ethically I'm not sure I really support. I can see how that would be in some ways safer for a photograph that's mounted on a page, but it removes a lot of the original intent of this
Yes.
object. And so until very, very, very late, honestly, in the discussion, I will continue to advocate for keeping objects as integral wholes if there's no pronounced ongoing preservation concern. If I can move that already deteriorated object into a safer housing, into a safer environment, into an area where there is user and research and even exhibition access to it, I will always veer toward that until there, like I spoke about the reback, until there is sort of a last decision that has to be taken. And those are not off the table. They're just, for me, considerably farther down the line. I very much advocate for keeping the original intent and object together as a unit. But it's one of the hardest parts about that decision making track is that the the bookbinder in me is not necessarily satisfied with that. I do want to maintain the history of this object as closely as I can. So there are, you know, two or three slightly imperfect or
Yeah. I mean, that's true with everybody.
not satisfying decisions. Yeah,
Conservation.
in whatever discipline. Sure. Yeah.
So I think those are the questions. So
Okay,
you
super.
have the email ID. So please keep
Yeah,
send examples of some challenging uh,
sure.
albums or some unique albums that you've encountered. I think it'll be nice. It'll add to the research and everything.
That would be great. Yeah, please and reach out, be in touch. I put my contact information there. And thank you, Padma, and thank you for everyone for coming and
Thank you,
attending.
Teresa, for a very nice presentation, and it's lovely to see the work. All the best to you.
Thank you. Great. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
Done, Georgia.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone,
Bye,
for
Padma.
joining us. Bye.